Alright, buckle up, buttercups, because we're about to dive into the night that turned Halloween from your favorite candy-grabbing free-for-all into the reason your parents started checking your Snickers bars like they were screening luggage at the airport. I'm talking about the night that made an entire generation of kids realize that sometimes the scariest monster isn't hiding under your bed. It's hiding in your pillowcase. This is the story of how one twisted individual turned the sweetest night of the year into a national nightmare. And trust me, by the time we're done here, you'll understand why your mum went full CSI on your candy haul every October 31st. So grab your flashlight, lock your doors, and maybe, just maybe, think twice before eating that fun-sized Milky Way you found rolling around in your bag. Welcome to the dark side of Halloween, folks. Population, you, me, and a whole lot of paranoia. Let me set the scene for you. It's 1974. Richard Nixon just resigned in disgrace. Streaking is somehow a thing people think is cool, and kids across America are living their best lives because helicopter parenting hasn't been invented yet. You could leave your house at dusk with a pillowcase and a dream, and nobody expected to see you until that pillowcase was heavy enough to double as a weapon. Halloween was pure, unadulterated freedom. No adult supervision required, no GPS tracking your every move, just you, your friends, and enough sugar to put a small elephant into a diabetic coma. It was beautiful, it was simple, it was perfect. And then on October 31st, 1974, in a quiet Houston suburb called Deer Park, Texas, everything changed. Not gradually, not slowly. In one night, with one unthinkable act, the entire landscape of American Halloween was rewritten. This wasn't an urban legend. This wasn't a campfire story your weird cousin made up to scare you. This was real, it was calculated, and it was so horrifyingly evil that it created ripples we're still feeling today, 50 years later. But here's where it gets interesting. And by interesting, I mean absolutely soul-crushing. The monster in this story wasn't some masked slasher lurking in the shadows. It wasn't a deranged stranger with a van and a plan. No, the person who destroyed Halloween as we knew it was someone far more terrifying. A father. A man who was supposed to protect children. Someone who looked completely normal, lived in a normal house, had a normal job, and was hiding the kind of evil that makes true crime documentarians weep tears of disturbed fascination. His name was Ronald Clark O'Brien, but after what he did, the world would come to know him by a different name, the Candyman. And no, not the fun kind with a candy factory and a questionable relationship with child labor laws. The kind that makes you want to set fire to every pixie sticks in existence and maybe reconsider this whole trusting humanity thing. Now, before we dive into the depths of this nightmare, I need you to understand something crucial. This story has layers, like an onion made of pure darkness and bad decisions. We're not just talking about one terrible night. We're talking about premeditation, manipulation, life insurance policies, and a plan so cold-blooded that even psychologists studying the case were like, yeah, this dude is something special. Special in the way that a dumpster fire is special. Special in the way that stepping on a Lego in the dark is special. You know, the worst kind of special. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to walk you through this entire twisted tale, from the planning stages to the aftermath that changed legislation across the entire country. We're going to explore the psychology of how someone could even conceive of something this monstrous. The investigation that unraveled faster than O'Brien probably hoped, and the lasting impact that made paranoid candy checking as much a part of Halloween as jack-o'-lanterns and cultural appropriation debates about costume choices. But wait, and this is important, we're also going to talk about the urban legends this case spawned, the copycat scares that followed, and the brutal truth about stranger danger that nobody wants to hear. Because, spoiler alert, the real danger was never the strangers. It was coming from inside the house. Are you ready? Because there's no turning back now. We're about to explore the darkest corners of Halloween history, and I promise you, this is going to make every horror movie you've ever watched look like a Disney Channel original movie in comparison. This is real. This happened, and it changed everything. Let's start at the very beginning, with a man who seemed completely unremarkable in every possible way, which, as we're about to learn, is exactly how the worst monsters move through the world, undetected. Ronald Clark O'Brien was born on October 19th, 1944, in Corsicana, Texas, which is about as small-town American as it gets. We're talking Friday night football, church on Sundays, and the kind of place where everyone knows everyone's business, or at least thinks they do. Young Ronald grew up in what appeared to be a normal family, went to normal schools, and by all accounts was aggressively average. Not the smartest kid in class, not the dumbest, not popular, not unpopular, just there, existing, like elevator music in human form. He graduated from Sam Houston State University, which, okay, good for him, I guess. He got married to a woman named Daneen in the late 1960s, and together they had 2 children, Timothy and Elizabeth. From the outside, they looked like the perfect American family. Dad, mom, 2 kids, probably a golden retriever somewhere in the mix. The O'Briens attended church regularly, participated in community events, and Ronald worked as an optician. Everything seemed fine, normal, safe. Except it wasn't, not even close. Because beneath that veneer of suburban respectability, Ronald O'Brien was drowning in debt, like it was his full-time job, and not the, oops, I bought too many lattes this month kind of debt. We're talking about the creditors are calling at all hours and my checks are bouncing like basketballs kind of debt. The man couldn't keep a job to save his life, literally, as we'll soon discover. He bounced from position to position like a pinball, leaving a trail of unpaid bills and borrowed money in his wake. By 1974, O'Brien owed over $100,000. And remember, this is 1974 money, so adjust for inflation, and you're looking at a sum that would make most people seriously consider faking their own death and moving to Belize. He had borrowed money from friends, family, co-workers, random acquaintances, and probably that guy who sells hot dogs on the corner. He was taking out loans to pay other loans, which is the financial equivalent of using gasoline to put out a fire. Everyone who knew him was aware that he was in trouble, but nobody, and I mean nobody, could have predicted just how far he'd be willing to go to solve his money problems. Here's the thing about debt that most true crime fans already know. It's one of the most powerful motivators for murder. Love and rage might get all the press, but good old-fashioned financial desperation has probably ended more lives than we'd like to admit. Money makes people do insane things. Rational, seemingly normal people will cross lines they never thought they'd cross when the walls start closing in and the collection agencies won't stop calling. But O'Brien wasn't just desperate. He was calculating. He was patient. And he was about to come up with a plan so twisted that it would earn him a place in the true crime hall of infamy, right next to the worst of the worst. Now, I need you to really sit with this next part, because it's where the story shifts from sad man with money troubles to, oh my God, call the police immediately. Sometime in early 1974, Ronald O'Brien started shopping around for life insurance policies on his children, both of them. Timothy, who was 8 years old, and Elizabeth, who was 5. He didn't take out one modest policy like a normal, slightly morbid parent might do. No. This man took out multiple policies from multiple companies, totaling, and I want you to really absorb this number, $40,000 per child. $40,000 per child in 1974. That's over $200,000 per kid in today's money for elementary school children. Children who were healthy, active, and had absolutely no reason to suddenly need that kind of coverage unless Daddy Dearest was planning something absolutely horrific. And here's the truly diabolical part. Some of these policies had double indemnity clauses for accidental death. You know what that means? It means if something accidental happened to these kids, the payout would double. Catching. Suddenly, we're talking about enough money to wipe out O'Brien's debts and still have plenty left over for, I don't know, therapy for the surviving family members who'd have to live with what he was about to do. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, wait, how did insurance companies let this happen? Didn't anyone think this was suspicious? The answer is different era, folks. This was pre-computer databases, pre-information sharing between companies, pre-red flags being raised when someone takes out suspiciously large policies on elementary school children. Each company operated independently, and O'Brien was careful to spread his applications around so no single company would see the full scope of what he was doing. Clever, absolutely. Evil, off the charts. But taking out the policies was only step one. Now he needed a plan, a method, a way to kill his own children. And yes, plural. Because this monster wasn't just targeting one kid, he was willing to murder both of them to maximize his payout in a way that would look completely accidental and wouldn't immediately point back to him. He needed what crime investigators call plausible deniability. He needed an alibi made of iron. He needed a scenario so perfect that nobody would ever suspect dear old Dad of being the monster he truly was. And then, like a twisted light bulb flickering on in his sociopathic brain, it hit him. Halloween. The one night of the year when children go door to door accepting candy from strangers. The one night when poisoned treats and tampered goodies were already part of the cultural zeitgeist thanks to urban legends and paranoid parents. The one night when he could potentially kill his kids and make it look like the work of some random psychopath dropping tainted candy into trick-or-treaters' bags. It was, in its own horrifying way, genius. Evil genius, but genius nonetheless. If something happened to his children while they were trick-or-treating, something involving poisoned candy that could have come from anyone, anywhere along their route, he'd just be another grieving father, a victim of a senseless tragedy, someone deserving of sympathy, support, and a hefty insurance payout. All he needed now was the perfect poison and the perfect delivery method And oh boy, did he find both. But hold on just a second, because before we get to the mechanics of how O'Brien planned to execute, pun absolutely intended, his sick scheme, we need to talk about the elephant in the room, the widespread belief that Halloween candy tampering was actually a thing that happened with any regularity. Because here's a truth bomb that's going to blow your mind. It pretty much wasn't. Not before O'Brien, anyway. He didn't just capitalize on a real danger. He capitalized on a fear that was almost entirely imaginary. And in doing so, he made it real. Meta, right? In the worst possible way. The mythology of the Halloween sadist, the stranger who lurks in the shadows, tampering with treats to harm random children, has been around since the 1950s. But here's the kicker. There's virtually no evidence that it actually happened with any frequency before 1974. Sure, there were isolated incidents here and there, most of which turned out to be hoaxes or accidents. Kids would find pins in their candy and claim someone tried to hurt them, but investigations would reveal they put it there themselves for attention. Parents would report suspicious items in their children's halls, but follow-ups showed nothing sinister. It was the equivalent of those razor blades in water slide stories that circulate every summer. Terrifying, viral, and almost entirely fictional. Sociologists and folklorists have studied this phenomenon extensively, and what they've found is fascinating in a deeply unsettling way. The Halloween sadist is what's called a contemporary legend, a story that reflects cultural anxieties more than actual statistical reality. In the post-World War II era, as American suburbs expanded and communities became less tight-knit, parents started worrying more about strangers and what might happen to their children outside their direct supervision. Halloween, with its built-in premise of kids approaching unfamiliar houses and accepting food from people they didn't know, became the perfect canvas for these fears to manifest. News media, always happy to turn anxiety into ratings, ran sensational stories about potential candy tampering every October. Is your child's Halloween candy safe? 5 things to check before letting your kids eat their treats. The hidden dangers lurking in your trick-or-treat bag. These stories created a feedback loop. Parents heard about supposed dangers, became more vigilant, and interpreted innocent anomalies. A slightly opened wrapper, a piece of candy that looked different, as evidence of tampering. This led to more reports, which led to more news coverage, which led to more paranoia, and round we went. But here's the thing. Before Ronald O'Brien, there was exactly one confirmed case of a child dying from intentionally poisoned Halloween candy. And that case had nothing to do with random strangers. In 1970, a 5-year-old boy named Kevin Toston died after allegedly eating heroin he found in his uncle's home, which was initially reported as being mixed with Halloween candy. Later investigations suggested the Halloween connection was either a misunderstanding or an attempt to deflect blame from the drug-using adults in the house. Either way, it wasn't a case of stranger danger. It was a case of danger from within the family, which, as we're about to see with O'Brien, is a disturbingly common theme. So when Ronald O'Brien started planning his Halloween murder scheme, he wasn't afraid of getting caught because candy tampering was so common that his crime would blend in. No, he was banking on something even more insidious. He was banking on the fact that everyone already believed candy tampering was common, even though it wasn't. He was going to create a tragedy that would validate everyone's worst fears while positioning himself as just another victim of a terrifying phenomenon. It was psychological manipulation on a societal level, and it might have worked. Except O'Brien made mistakes. Several of them. Because even the most carefully planned murders tend to fall apart under scrutiny. And this one would unravel faster than you can say forensic investigation. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's get back to the planning phase, where our not-so-dear friend Ronald was busy figuring out the specific details of how to murder his own children and make it look like an accident. O'Brien needed a poison that would work quickly. He couldn't risk the kids eating the candy and then hours or days passing before symptoms appeared, because that would give investigators too much time to trace everything back to its source. He needed something fast-acting, dramatic, and ideally something that wouldn't immediately scream murder to medical examiners. After all, if the death looked too obviously intentional, the whole accident angle would fall apart. So where does a suburban dad with no criminal history and no obvious connections to the black market go to find deadly poison? If you guessed the internet, nice try. But remember, this is 1974. Google won't exist for another 24 years, and the most high-tech thing in most homes is a rotary phone attached to the wall with a cord that's somehow always tangled, no matter what you do. O'Brien couldn't just order potassium cyanide on Amazon with next-day Prime delivery. He had to get creative. And get creative he did. O'Brien worked as an optician, which meant he had access to certain chemicals used in lens manufacturing. He started researching poisons that would be fast-acting and lethal, and he eventually settled on potassium cyanide, a substance so deadly that a dose smaller than a packet of Sweet and Low can kill an adult human within minutes. It's the kind of poison that shows up in spy movies and Agatha Christie novels, the kind that works so fast your victims barely have time to realize something's wrong before they're dead. Cyanide kills by preventing your cells from using oxygen. Essentially, you suffocate at a cellular level while your lungs are still taking in air. It's brutal, it's agonizing, and it's mercifully quick. Though merciful feels like the wrong word when we're talking about a father planning to use it on his 8-year-old son. The symptoms include rapid breathing, seizures, loss of consciousness, and death, usually within minutes of ingesting a sufficient dose. It's not peaceful, it's not painless, it's violent and terrifying, and O'Brien knew this. He knew exactly what he was going to put his children through, and he did it anyway. But here's where O'Brien's plan shows just how calculating he was. He didn't just want to kill his kids. He wanted to create a scenario where multiple children were at risk, because if only his children received poisoned candy, he'd be the obvious suspect. So he decided to expand his victim pool. He would poison several children's candy, including his own kids, so that it would look like a random act of violence by some Halloween psychopath. His children would just be unlucky casualties in a broader attack, and he'd be the grieving father who'd lost his son to a senseless act of evil. The logic is so twisted, it almost wraps back around to being impressive, except it's not impressive at all, because we're talking about murdering children, including his own, for insurance money. This wasn't the work of someone having a mental breakdown or acting in the heat of passion. This was cold, calculated, premeditated murder with a side of collateral damage. This was a man who valued money more than human life, including the lives of his own kids. This was evil in its purest, most undiluted form. Now O'Brien needed a delivery method, a way to get the poison into his victims without it being obvious that the candy had been tampered with. He needed something that could hold enough cyanide to be lethal, but would look innocent enough the kids would eat it without question. He needed packaging that could be resealed convincingly enough to pass a casual inspection. He needed the perfect vehicle for murder, and he found it in the most innocuous of places: pixie sticks. For those of you who somehow made it through childhood without encountering these sugar delivery systems, pixie sticks are essentially flavored sugar in a paper tube. A simple, cheap candy that every kid loved because it was pure, unadulterated sweetness with no pretense of being anything else. They were portable, popular, and perfect for trick-or-treating. They were also, as O'Brien realized, perfect for his purposes. The tubes were sealed with a simple fold at the top, which meant they could be opened, emptied, refilled with poison, and resealed without leaving obvious evidence of tampering. The bright colors and fun packaging would appeal to kids, and the powdered form of the candy meant he could mix cyanide in without it being visually obvious. It was diabolical, it was perfect, and it was about to destroy multiple families in one terrible night. Now, we need to talk about the shopping trip from hell, because O'Brien didn't just wake up on Halloween morning and decide to execute his plan. No, this required preparation, which meant he had to acquire both the poison and the pixie sticks. And both of these shopping trips would later become crucial pieces of evidence in his conviction. Let's start with the cyanide, because acquiring deadly poison is thankfully not as easy as picking up milk at the grocery store, though in the 1970s it was disturbingly easier than it would be today. O'Brien worked as an optician, but he didn't have direct access to potassium cyanide through his workplace, so he had to get creative. And by creative, I mean sketchy as hell, in ways that would immediately raise red flags if anyone had been paying attention. In the weeks leading up to Halloween 1974, O'Brien made multiple inquiries about purchasing potassium cyanide. He contacted chemical supply companies, called labs, and even approached people he knew in industries that might have access to such substances. He claimed he needed it to kill rodents in his workplace, which is a lie so transparent it wouldn't fool a particularly clever golden retriever. Most of the places he contacted either refused to sell to him outright or required documentation and licenses he didn't have. But O'Brien was persistent, and eventually he found what he was looking for. The exact source of his cyanide would become a crucial question in the investigation. Prosecutors believed he obtained it through his connections in the optical industry, possibly from someone who had access to chemistry supplies and didn't ask too many questions. What we know for certain is that by late October 1974, Ronald O'Brien had possession of enough potassium cyanide to kill several people, and he was ready to put it to use. The pixie sticks were easier to acquire, obviously, because they're candy and not deadly poison. O'Brien purchased several packages of the jumbo-sized pixie sticks, the big ones, about 8 inches long. which were perfect for his purposes because they held more product and would need to hold enough cyanide to be lethal. He specifically chose the jumbo size because a regular pixie sticks wouldn't hold enough poison to ensure a fatal dose, and he couldn't risk his victims surviving because that would lead to investigations, questions, and ultimately his arrest. Here's where O'Brien's attention to detail becomes apparent in the most horrifying way. He didn't just dump poison into the tubes and call it a day. He carefully opened each pixie sticks, emptied out about half the sugar, mixed in the cyanide, enough to kill an adult, let alone a child, and then added some of the original sugar back on top to disguise the poison. He wanted the kids to taste the sweet sugar first, to not immediately detect that something was wrong, and to ingest enough of the mixture to ensure a fatal dose before they realized they should stop eating. Think about the level of planning that requires. Think about the cold-blooded calculation involved in sitting at a table, probably in his own home while his children slept upstairs, preparing poison candy designed to kill them. Most of us can't even plan our weekly meals without forgetting something at the grocery store. But this man planned a multi-victim murder with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. It's the kind of detailed preparation that makes you understand why prosecutors would later argue that this was one of the most coldly premeditated murders in Texas history. After mixing the poison and resealing the tubes, which he did carefully enough that casual observation wouldn't reveal any tampering, O'Brien had 5 poisoned pixie sticks, 5 weapons designed to look like treats, 5 time bombs wrapped in bright, cheerful paper, 1 for his son, Timothy, 1 for his daughter, Elizabeth, and 3 more for other children who would be trick-or-treating with them that night. Because remember, he needed other victims to make it look like a random attack. The stage was set. The weapons were prepared. All that remained was for Halloween night to arrive and for O'Brien to execute. And again, pun absolutely intended, his twisted plan. And on October 31st, 1974, that's exactly what happened. Halloween night. 1974 in Deer Park, Texas, started out like any other Halloween night across America. Kids were getting into their costumes, some bought from the store, some homemade, all of them representing that perfect blend of creativity and mild costume-related disappointment that defined Halloween in the pre-internet era. Parents were preparing for the evening ahead, whether that meant taking younger kids trick-or-treating or staying home to hand out candy to the neighborhood horde. The weather was decent, cool but not cold, dry and clear. Perfect conditions for an evening of candy acquisition. Ronald O'Brien had been planning this night for months, but to anyone watching him that evening, he seemed like just another dad preparing to take his kids trick-or-treating. He helped Timothy, age 8, and Elizabeth, age 5, get into their costumes. He chatted with his wife, Danine. He put on a friendly, normal face, the mask of suburban dadhood that he'd been wearing for years. Underneath that mask was a monster who had 5 poison pixie sticks hidden away, ready to hand out to children, including his own, before the night was over. The O'Briens had made plans to go trick-or-treating with another family, the Bettons. Jim Betton was a neighbor and friend of Ronald's, and he had 2 children of his own, who were around the same age as the O'Brien kids. This wasn't unusual. Parents often teamed up on Halloween to corral the sugar-crazed mob of children, and provide some semblance of adult supervision. For the Bettons, it was just a normal Halloween outing with friends. For Ronald O'Brien, it was the perfect setup for mass murder. The group set out around dusk, which in late October in Texas means somewhere around 6:30 or 7 p.m. The kids were excited, carrying their pillowcases or plastic pumpkin buckets, ready to haul in enough candy to sustain them through multiple stomach aches and at least 3 lectures from their parents about moderation. The adults followed along, chatting and making small talk, playing the role of Halloween security detail. They hit several houses in the neighborhood, following the standard trick-or-treat route that every suburban kid knows by heart. Start on your own street. Work your way through the most densely populated areas where the houses are close together, and avoid the weird house that always gives out pennies or toothbrushes instead of real candy. The kids ran from door to door with that specific brand of Halloween energy that comes from equal parts excitement and sugar, their bags getting progressively heavier with each stop. And then they came to a house that would become crucial to the investigation, a house that appeared to be dark with no porch light on, which in Halloween terms is the universal signal for "we're not participating tonight." Most trick-or-treaters would have skipped it and moved on. But the kids ran up to the door anyway, ever optimistic, and knocked or rang the bell. Nothing happened. No one answered. After a few moments, the kids rejoined the adults, and they continued on their route. This is where the timelines get interesting, and where O'Brien's plan starts to unfold. According to later testimony, at some point shortly after they left the unoccupied house, maybe immediately after, maybe a few minutes later, Ronald O'Brien suddenly produced 5 pixie sticks, big, jumbo-sized pixie sticks. He told the kids that a man at the house that hadn't answered the door had actually come out after they left and given him candy to distribute to the children. He made a point of saying this in front of Jim Beaton and within earshot of multiple witnesses, establishing the narrative that these pixie sticks came from an unknown house on their route. He handed 1 pixie sticks to Timothy, his 8-year-old son, 1 to Elizabeth, his 5-year-old daughter, 1 to each of the Beaton children, and he saved 1 for a boy named Whitney Parker, another child he knew from church. Think about what's happening here. O'Brien is handing out poisoned candy to 5 children, including his own son and daughter, and he's doing it in front of witnesses while establishing a cover story. He's creating an alibi in real time, setting up the narrative that will explain how his children came to ingest poison while simultaneously deflecting suspicion away from himself. It's manipulation on a breathtaking scale, and it would have worked if not for several crucial mistakes he didn't even know he was making yet. The trick-or-treating continued for a while longer. The kids added more candy to their collections. The adults chatted and kept watch. Everything seemed normal, just another Halloween night in suburban America. But Ronald O'Brien was sweating this out internally because he needed those kids to eat the poisoned pixie sticks, and they needed to eat them soon. The longer those pixie sticks sat in their bags, the more opportunity there was for parents to inspect them, for the candy to get mixed in with everything else, for his carefully laid plan to fall apart. Eventually, the group returned to the O'Brien home. It was getting late for the younger kids, and everyone was ready to wind down, count their haul, and start the great Halloween tradition of trading candy like tiny Wall Street brokers negotiating derivatives. The Bettons said their goodbyes and took their children home, poisoned pixie sticks tucked somewhere in their bags among the Snickers and Tootsie Rolls and those weird peanut butter taffy things that no one actually likes, but everyone somehow ends up with. Inside the O'Brien home, the kids started going through their candy, and this is where Ronald O'Brien made his move. He actively encouraged Timothy to eat the pixie sticks. Not just, hey, enjoy your candy, but specifically pushing the pixie sticks. He told Timothy he should eat it now, before bed. Some accounts say he told Timothy he couldn't eat any other candy until he ate the pixie sticks first. He was, in the most horrifying way possible, urging his 8-year-old son to consume the poison he prepared for him. Timothy, being 8 years old and having no reason to suspect his own father of trying to murder him, opened the pixie sticks and started eating it. He poured some of the powder directly into his mouth, the way kids do with pixie sticks. Just dump it in and let it dissolve on your tongue in a concentrated burst of sugar-driven happiness. Except this wasn't happiness waiting for him. This was cyanide. This was death in a cheerful paper tube. Almost immediately, Timothy began complaining that the candy tasted bitter. Cyanide has a distinctive bitter almond taste, and when mixed with sugar, it creates a flavor that's notably off. Timothy, in his innocence, had no way of knowing what that bitter taste meant. He just knew the candy didn't taste right. He told his father it was bitter, and O'Brien, "Stay with me here because this is where the monster really shows himself," told Timothy to keep eating it anyway, urged him to finish it, encouraged his own son to consume more of the poison that was already starting to kill him. Timothy ate more of the pixie sticks. Within minutes, he began to show symptoms. He started vomiting. He complained of stomach pain. He began having difficulty breathing. His parents, and I use that term loosely when referring to Ronald because this man gave up any right to be called a father when he poisoned his own kid, called for medical help, but it was already too late. By the time paramedics arrived, Timothy was convulsing, his body shutting down as the cyanide prevented his cells from using oxygen. They rushed him to the hospital, but there was nothing anyone could do. Timothy O'Brien was pronounced dead just before midnight on Halloween 1974, less than an hour after eating the poisoned candy his father had given him. An 8-year-old boy dead on Halloween from poisoned candy given to him by his own father for insurance money. Let that sink in. Really sit with the absolute depravity of that reality. The hospital staff knew immediately that something was wrong beyond a simple tragic accident. Cyanide poisoning has distinctive symptoms, and the speed of Timothy's death raised immediate red flags. This wasn't a case of anaphylactic shock from an unknown allergy. This wasn't a choking incident or a freak medical emergency. This was poisoning, and it was clearly intentional. Within hours of Timothy's death, the police were involved and an investigation was underway. But here's where things get even more twisted, if you can believe that's possible. While Timothy lay dying, O'Brien's first thought, his very first thought, wasn't to grieve or to comfort his daughter, who had almost eaten a poisoned pixie sticks too. No, his first thought was about the insurance money. Multiple witnesses would later testify that O'Brien seemed remarkably unconcerned about his son's death and suspiciously focused on when he could collect on Timothy's life insurance policies. Some reports indicate he was calling insurance companies within hours of his son's death. Hours before his son's body was even cold. This man was trying to cash in on his murder. But Ronald O'Brien had made several critical mistakes, and law enforcement was already putting together a picture that looked nothing like the random Halloween sadist narrative O'Brien had tried to construct. First, there was the matter of those other pixie sticks. Remember, O'Brien had handed out 5 total. 1 to Timothy, who was now dead, 1 to Elizabeth, his daughter, and 3 to other children. Police immediately located all of the remaining pixie sticks and had them tested. Every single one contained lethal doses of potassium cyanide. 5 poisoned candies, all the same brand, all the same size, all containing the same poison. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was targeted. This was planned. This was deliberate. Second, there was O'Brien's story about where the pixie sticks came from. He claimed a man from a dark house had given him the candy after the kids had already left. Jim Betton, the neighbor who was with them that night, was interviewed by police. He told them that he didn't remember anyone coming out of any house to give O'Brien candy. He didn't see anyone hand O'Brien anything. In fact, his version of events suggested that O'Brien had simply produced the pixie sticks at some point during their trick-or-treating route without any clear explanation of where they'd come from. Police went to the house that O'Brien claimed was the source of the poisoned candy. The dark house, where supposedly a man had run out to give him candy after the kids left. You know what they found? The house belonged to a man named Courtney Melvin, an air traffic controller who had been at work during the hours in question. He had a solid alibi, confirmed by multiple co-workers and official records. He wasn't home. He didn't give out candy. He had nothing to do with any of this. O'Brien's story was falling apart faster than a chocolate bar in a hot car. Third, and perhaps most damning, investigators started looking into O'Brien's financial situation and discovered the insurance policies. $40,000 per child. Multiple policies taken out just months before Halloween. Double indemnity clauses for accidental death. It was like a neon sign pointing directly at O'Brien, screaming, "Motive, M-O-T-I-V-E, exclamation mark, motive." Any experienced investigator knows that when someone dies under suspicious circumstances and there's a large insurance policy involved, you start looking very hard at the beneficiary. And when that beneficiary is also the last person to handle the murder weapon, in this case, poisoned candy, you've basically got your suspect gift-wrapped and ready for prosecution. Within days of Timothy's death, Ronald O'Brien went from grieving father to prime suspect to arrested defendant. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Forensic analysis confirmed that all 5 pixie sticks contained lethal doses of the same type of cyanide. O'Brien couldn't explain where he'd obtained the pixie sticks or produce anyone who could verify his story about the mysterious man at the dark house. His financial records painted a picture of a man desperate enough to do anything for money, including murder his own children. And perhaps most tellingly, witnesses came forward describing O'Brien's bizarre behavior in the aftermath of Timothy's death, including his inappropriate focus on collecting insurance money before his son was even buried. The police arrested Ronald Clark O'Brien on November the 5th, 1974, just 5 days after his son's death. He was charged with capital murder and multiple counts of attempted murder for the other poisoned pixie sticks he distributed. The arrest made national headlines because this wasn't just another murder case. This was the Halloween candy tampering case that parents had been warned about for decades, except with a horrifying twist. The monster wasn't a stranger lurking in the shadows. The monster was Dad. The call was coming from inside the house, as they say in every horror movie ever made. The people of Deer Park and the broader Houston area were in shock. Neighbors who'd known the O'Briens for years couldn't reconcile the friendly, church-going man they knew with the cold-blooded killer who'd been arrested. This is a common phenomenon in true crime cases. The neighbors always say, "He seems so normal," or "We never suspected anything." Because monsters don't usually announce themselves. They don't wear signs advertising their evil intentions. They blend in, they smile, they wave, they take their kids trick-or-treating while carrying poisoned candy in their pockets. Daneen O'Brien, Ronald's wife, was devastated on multiple levels. Not only had she lost her son, but she learned that her husband, the man she'd married and built a life with, had murdered him, that he'd planned to murder their daughter too, that the whole life they'd built together was a lie covering a darkness she'd never seen. She immediately filed for divorce and cooperated fully with the investigation. She was as much a victim in this nightmare as anyone, having trusted a man who turned out to be a monster. As the investigation continued, more damning evidence emerged. Investigators interviewed dozens of people connected to O'Brien, and a pattern of behavior emerged that painted a picture of a man who'd been planning this for months, maybe even longer. Co-workers testified that O'Brien had made strange comments about poisoning and insurance money. Chemical supply companies came forward with records of O'Brien's attempts to purchase potassium cyanide. People he'd borrowed money from described a man who was drowning in debt and becoming increasingly desperate. The prosecution's case was building into something virtually airtight, and O'Brien's defense team knew it. But they had a job to do, and that job was to defend their client, no matter how obviously guilty he appeared to be. The question was, what defense could you possibly mount against this kind of evidence? But before we get to the trial, and trust me, the trial is a whole circus of its own, we need to talk about what happened to the other children who received poisoned pixie sticks that night. Because remember, Timothy wasn't O'Brien's only intended victim. There were 4 other kids walking around with lethal doses of cyanide in their Halloween bags. And if any of them had eaten those pixie sticks before police tracked them down, we'd be talking about one of the worst mass murders in American history. Elizabeth O'Brien, Ronald's 5-year-old daughter, had been given one of the poisoned pixie sticks. According to later testimony, she'd wanted to eat it that night, but her father, and wrap your head around this, actually prevented her from eating it. Why? The most likely explanation, according to prosecutors, is that O'Brien wanted Timothy to eat his first so he could gauge the effects and timing. He needed to see how quickly the poison worked, how obvious the symptoms were, and how authorities would respond. Timothy was, in the most horrific sense, a test case. Once O'Brien confirmed that the poison worked as planned, and that his cover story about the mysterious house was being accepted, he would have encouraged Elizabeth to eat hers. She was saved not by her father's love, because clearly that didn't exist, but by her brother's murder happening too quickly for O'Brien to execute the rest of his plan. The Benton children, who'd been trick-or-treating with the O'Briens that night, both received poisoned pixie sticks. Thankfully, when they got home that night, their parents did what millions of parents do every Halloween. They inspected the candy. They didn't spot anything obviously wrong with the pixie sticks. O'Brien had been careful in his tampering, but they decided the kids had eaten enough candy for one night and told them to save the rest for later. That simple parental decision to limit sugar intake saved their lives. The next day, when news of Timothy's death spread and police were frantically trying to locate the other pixie sticks, the Bettons checked their children's candy bags and found the still unopened poisoned pixie sticks. They turned them over to police immediately, and forensic testing confirmed what investigators already suspected: lethal doses of cyanide, identical to what killed Timothy. The fifth pixie sticks had been given to a boy named Whitney Parker, a 10-year-old who attended church with the O'Briens. Ronald had actually made a special trip to the Parker home after trick-or-treating was over to deliver the poison candy, claiming he'd gotten extras and wanted to share them with his church friends. The Parkers thought this was a nice gesture from a friendly neighbor. They had no idea they were accepting a murder weapon. Whitney, like the Benton children, didn't eat his pixie sticks that night. When police came calling the next day to collect it, Mr. Parker turned it over, and testing revealed, surprise, surprise, more cyanide. 4 children saved by nothing more than chance and parental caution. 4 families who came within inches of losing a child to a psychopath's insurance fraud scheme. The scope of what O'Brien had been willing to do, to kill not just his own children, but other people's kids as collateral damage, shocked even hardened investigators who'd seen plenty of terrible things in their careers. Now here's where the psychology gets interesting, and by interesting I mean deeply disturbing. O'Brien wasn't just trying to kill his son for insurance money. He was willing to murder multiple children, including kids he knew personally, kids from his church, kids whose parents considered him a friend, just to make his own crime look less suspicious. This wasn't the act of someone having a breakdown or experiencing a moment of desperate insanity. This was calculated sociopathy. This was someone who fundamentally lacked the ability to empathize with other human beings and saw them purely as objects to be used in service of his own goals. Psychologists who later studied the case noted that O'Brien displayed classic signs of antisocial personality disorder, a profound disregard for the rights and feelings of others, a willingness to manipulate and deceive, and an absence of remorse or guilt. Some experts suggested he might also have had narcissistic traits, given his apparent belief that he was clever enough to get away with such an audacious crime. The combination made for a particularly dangerous individual, someone who could plan complex crimes, manipulate those around him, and feel absolutely nothing about the devastation he caused. But here's what really gets me about this case. O'Brien wasn't some criminal mastermind. He wasn't a genius who'd studied forensics and psychology to craft the perfect crime. He was a failed optician who couldn't hold down a job and thought he could murder his way out of debt. His plan had holes in it from the beginning. The insurance policies were too large and too recent not to raise suspicion. His story about where the candy came from fell apart under the slightest scrutiny, and he left a trail of evidence that even a moderately competent investigator would follow straight back to him. The scary thing isn't that he was brilliant. The scary thing is that he was ordinary, and he almost got away with it anyway. Think about how close this came to being an unsolved mystery. If Timothy had been older and sneakier about eating candy without his parents knowing, and if he'd eaten the pixie sticks and somewhere away from home where his father wasn't immediately present, the connection between the poisoned candy and O'Brien might have been much harder to establish. If the other children had eaten their pixie sticks and died, creating multiple victims across different families, investigators might have initially believed the stranger danger narrative and wasted precious time looking for a random Halloween sadist who didn't exist. O'Brien's plan failed not because he was stupid, but because he made a few crucial mistakes, and because investigators were smart enough to see through his story quickly. The case serves as a reminder that most murders aren't committed by evil geniuses in remote lairs petting white cats and monologuing about their plans. Most murders are committed by regular people who make terrible decisions for selfish reasons and screw up the execution because they're not as clever as they think they are. O'Brien thought he was pulling off the perfect crime. In reality, he left so much evidence that the prosecution's case practically built itself. So now we fast forward to May 1975, about 6 months after Timothy's death, and the trial of Ronald Clark O'Brien is about to begin in Houston, Texas. The media coverage is absolutely massive because this case has everything true crime junkies love: a murdered child, poisoned Halloween candy, a father revealed as a monster, insurance fraud, and a defendant who's either a diabolical killer or, according to his defense team, a grieving father being railroaded by an overzealous prosecution. Spoiler alert, he was definitely the former. The trial was held in Harris County, and jury selection was a nightmare because literally everyone in the Houston area had heard about the case. Finding 12 people who hadn't already formed an opinion about O'Brien's guilt was like trying to find someone who's never heard of Star Wars. Technically possible, but you're going to have to look pretty hard. The judge eventually assembled a jury, and the trial began with the prosecution laying out their case in devastating detail. The lead prosecutor was a man named Mike Hinton, who approached this case with the kind of righteous fury that comes from knowing you're trying to convict someone who murdered his own child for money. Hinton's opening statement laid out the prosecution's theory in stark terms. Ronald O'Brien was a man drowning in debt who saw his children not as human beings to be loved and protected, but as assets to be liquidated. He took out massive insurance policies on them, acquired potassium cyanide, prepared poisoned Halloween candy, distributed that candy to his own kids and others to create cover for his crime, and then actively encouraged his son to eat the poison that would kill him. It was premeditated murder in its most cold-blooded form, and Hinton promised the jury he'd prove it beyond any reasonable doubt. The prosecution's case was built on several pillars of evidence, and they methodically presented each one to the jury. First came testimony about the insurance policies. Representatives from multiple insurance companies testified about O'Brien's applications, the amounts involved, and the timing of when these policies were purchased. The numbers were staggering: $40,000 per child in $1974, all taken out within months of the murder. One insurance agent testified that O'Brien had been unusually persistent and specific about wanting policies with accidental death benefits. It painted a clear picture. O'Brien was planning for his children to die accidentally, and he wanted to make sure he'd be compensated handsomely when it happened. Then came testimony about O'Brien's financial situation. The prosecution brought in creditors, former employers, friends and family members who'd loaned him money, and financial experts who walked through the litany of debts O'Brien had accumulated. It was damning. Here was a man who owed money to basically everyone he'd ever met, who was bouncing checks left and right, who was getting threatening letters from collection agencies, and who was facing the very real possibility of bankruptcy and financial ruin. Motive? Check big red check mark right next to desperate for money. Next up, the forensic evidence. Toxicologists testified about the cyanide found in all 5 pixie sticks, explaining in detail how much was present, enough to kill an adult, let alone a child, how it had been mixed with the sugar, and how quickly it would have taken effect once ingested. Medical examiners walked the jury through exactly what happened to Timothy's body after he ingested the poison: the cellular asphyxiation, the seizures, the rapid onset of symptoms, and the inevitable death. It was clinical, detailed, and absolutely heartbreaking. The jury heard exactly how Timothy O'Brien died, and it wasn't pretty. The most compelling testimony, however, came from the witnesses who'd been with the O'Briens on Halloween night. Jim Beaton, the neighbor who'd gone trick-or-treating with them, testified that he never saw anyone hand O'Brien the pixie sticks. He testified that O'Brien's story about a man running out of a dark house didn't match his memory of events. He testified about O'Brien's odd behavior that night and in the days following Timothy's death. His testimony contradicted O'Brien's version of events at almost every turn. Other witnesses testified about O'Brien's behavior after Timothy's death. Multiple people described how O'Brien seemed oddly unconcerned about his son's death and strangely focused on the insurance money. One particularly damning witness testified that O'Brien had asked about collecting insurance money within hours of Timothy being pronounced dead. Another testified that O'Brien had been calling insurance companies while his son's body was still at the morgue. It painted a picture of a man who wasn't grieving, who wasn't devastated, who was instead treating his son's death like a business transaction that needed to be finalized. The prosecution also brought in people from chemical supply companies who testified that O'Brien had contacted them in the weeks before Halloween trying to purchase potassium cyanide. He'd claimed he needed it for work, but when these companies asked for documentation or credentials, he'd been unable to provide them. Some refused to sell to him outright. These witnesses established that O'Brien had been actively seeking out the specific poison that ended up killing his son, undermining any defense claim that the poisoned candy could have come from someone else. Then there was the testimony from Courtney Melvin, the man who owned the house where O'Brien claimed to have gotten the candy. Melvin testified that he wasn't home on Halloween night, that he was at work, and that he had time cards and witness statements proving it. He testified that he'd never seen O'Brien before, never given out candy that night, and had nothing whatsoever to do with the poisoned pixie sticks. This demolished O'Brien's cover story completely, If the candy didn't come from the house O'Brien claimed it came from, and it clearly didn't, then where did it come from? The only logical answer: O'Brien had brought it with him, prepared in advance, ready to distribute to his victims. The prosecution rested their case after presenting a mountain of evidence that was frankly overwhelming. They'd established motive, means, and opportunity. They'd shown that O'Brien needed money desperately, that he'd taken out huge insurance policies on his children, that he'd sought to acquire cyanide, that his story about where the poisoned candy came from was a lie, and that his behavior after Timothy's death was consistent with guilt rather than grief. If this was a game of Clue, the answer was Mr. O'Brien on Halloween night with the poisoned pixie sticks. Now here's where we talk about the defense. And honestly, this might be the shortest section in this entire script, because the defense didn't have much to work with. Like, at all. When your client is caught red-handed with this much evidence against him, your options are limited. You can either try to poke holes in the prosecution's case, hope the jury decides to ignore overwhelming evidence for some reason, or go for an insanity defense and hope the jury buys that your client was too mentally ill to understand what he was doing. O'Brien's defense attorneys chose to attack the prosecution's evidence and present an alternative theory. Ronald O'Brien was innocent. The police had rushed to judgment, and somewhere out there was a real killer who'd gotten away with murder while the authorities focused on an easy target. It was, to put it mildly, a tough sell. When the evidence against you includes massive insurance policies, attempts to purchase cyanide, a fake story about where the poisoned candy came from, and suspicious behavior that would make even the most naive person go, that's weird. You're fighting an uphill battle while wearing roller skates and carrying a refrigerator. The defense tried to suggest that someone else could have slipped the poisoned pixie sticks into the children's bags during trick-or-treating. This theory required the jury to believe that a random stranger had somehow obtained identical jumbo pixie sticks, poisoned them with the same type of cyanide, and managed to slip them into the bags of 5 specific children, including both of O'Brien's kids, without anyone noticing. It also required ignoring all the evidence about O'Brien's financial motive, his attempts to buy cyanide, and his behavior after the murder. The jury was not impressed. They tried to explain away the insurance policies by suggesting that O'Brien was just being a responsible father looking out for his family's future. This might have worked if O'Brien had taken out reasonable policies at reasonable times. But $40,000 per child, multiple policies from multiple companies, all taken out within months of the murder, with double indemnity clauses for accidental death. That's not responsible parenting. That's premeditation with a neon sign. The defense tried to discredit some of the witnesses, suggesting they were mistaken or lying. But when you have multiple witnesses telling consistent stories that all contradict your client's version of events, and when physical evidence backs up what those witnesses are saying, you're not going to win that battle. The defense's cross-examinations were thorough, but they couldn't shake the fundamental facts. O'Brien's story didn't add up. His financial situation gave him a clear motive, and he was the only person who had both the means and opportunity to poison those pixie sticks. Perhaps most tellingly, Ronald O'Brien did not testify in his own defense. This is significant because While defendants have the right not to testify, and legally, juries aren't supposed to hold it against them, the reality is that when someone is accused of murdering their own child, and they don't even bother to get on the stand and deny it, juries notice. They wonder, if you're innocent, why won't you say so under oath? If the prosecution's story is wrong, why won't you tell us what really happened? O'Brien's silence spoke volumes, and none of what it said was good for his defense. The defense's closing argument was essentially, the prosecution's case has some holes. Reasonable doubt exists, and you should acquit. But when the prosecution's case is built on a mountain of physical evidence, financial records, witness testimony, and forensic science, claiming there's reasonable doubt is like standing in a rainstorm and insisting you're not getting wet. The jury wasn't buying it. The trial lasted several weeks, but the jury deliberation was surprisingly quick, less than an hour. Now, when you hear about a murder trial jury coming back in under an hour, that's usually not good news for the defendant. It means they took one look at the evidence, one look at each other, and went, are we all seeing what I'm seeing? Yeah? Okay, guilty. Who wants lunch? That's essentially what happened here. The jury found Ronald Clark O'Brien guilty of capital murder for the death of his son, Timothy, and guilty on multiple counts of attempted murder for the poisoned pixie sticks he'd given to the other children. The conviction was handed down in June 1975, and now the trial moved into its second phase, the penalty phase, where the jury would decide whether O'Brien should receive life in prison or the death penalty. In Texas, the death penalty requires the jury to answer yes to two questions. Is the defendant a continuing threat to society? And was the crime heinous, atrocious, and cruel? For Ronald O'Brien, those questions were about as easy to answer as, is water wet? And does the Pope wear a funny hat? The prosecution argued that O'Brien was absolutely a continuing threat. After all, he'd been willing to murder multiple children, including his own, for money. If he'd gotten away with it, there's every reason to believe he would have killed his daughter Elizabeth too, and possibly others if the insurance payouts proved profitable. As for heinous, atrocious, and cruel, the man poisoned his 8-year-old son with cyanide and then actively encouraged him to eat more of the poison even after the boy complained it tasted bitter. He planned this for months. He prepared the poison carefully. He distributed it to multiple children. He used Halloween, a holiday children love, as cover for mass murder. If that doesn't qualify as heinous, atrocious, and cruel, literally nothing does. The jury didn't even need to deliberate long on this phase either. They came back with a recommendation of death. The judge accepted the recommendation and sentenced Ronald Clark O'Brien to death by electrocution, though this would later be changed to lethal injection when Texas switched its execution method. O'Brien was sent to death row at the Ellis Unit in Huntsville, Texas, where he would spend the next decade exhausting his appeals. But the story doesn't end with the conviction. Oh no, because what Ronald O'Brien did that Halloween night in 1974 had ripple effects that extended far beyond his own family and far beyond that one terrible night. His crime fundamentally changed how America views Halloween, how parents supervise their children's trick-or-treating, and how we think about candy safety. O'Brien created the very fear he tried to exploit, and in doing so, He ruined Halloween for everyone. Thanks, asshole. Before we talk about the lasting impact, though, let's address what happened to O'Brien on death row. Because his time there was, let's say, unpleasant. And that's putting it mildly. See, there's a hierarchy even in prison. And at the very bottom of that hierarchy, below the murderers, below the drug dealers, below the thieves and fraudsters, are people who hurt children. And at the very, very bottom, in a special circle of prison hell reserved for the absolute worst of the worst, are people who murder children. Specifically, their own children. Ronald O'Brien was not popular in prison. That's like saying the Titanic had a slide water problem. It's technically true, but vastly understates the situation. O'Brien was universally hated by both guards and inmates. Other death row prisoners refused to associate with him. He received constant threats. He was attacked multiple times. Even hardened criminals who'd done terrible things themselves looked at O'Brien and went, "Yeah, that guy's a monster." There are stories, some verified, some apocryphal, about other inmates trying to poison O'Brien's food, which is ironic in a dark, poetic justice kind of way. Guards allegedly looked the other way when O'Brien was threatened or assaulted. One famous story claims that every year on Halloween, fellow death row inmates would chant "Tick-tock, tick-tock" outside O'Brien's cell, counting down to his execution. Whether this actually happened or is just one of those prison legends that gets passed around, it illustrates how thoroughly despised O'Brien was, even among people who weren't exactly saints themselves. O'Brien spent his time on death row filing appeal after appeal, which is standard procedure in capital cases. The appeals process for death penalty cases is deliberately slow and thorough because, you can't unexecute someone if you get it wrong. O'Brien's lawyers argued that he didn't receive a fair trial, that evidence was improperly admitted, that the jury was biased. Basically, every standard death penalty appeal argument. None of them worked. Court after court reviewed his case and found that the conviction was solid, the trial was fair, and the sentence was appropriate. His final appeal was denied by the US Supreme Court, and his execution date was set. On March 31st, 1984, almost 10 years after Timothy's death, Ronald Clark O'Brien was executed by lethal injection at the Texas State Penitentiary in Huntsville. He was 39 years old. His final words were, "What is about to transpire in a few moments is wrong." However, we as human beings do make mistakes and errors. This execution is one of those wrongs, yet doesn't mean our whole system of justice is wrong. Therefore, I would forgive all who have taken part in any way in my death. And I would hope that each of you would in turn would forgive me for any wrong I have done to you. Read that again. I would forgive all who have taken part in any way in my death. Not, I'm sorry for what I did. Not, I apologize to my family and the families I destroyed. Not, I take responsibility for murdering my son and attempting to murder multiple other children. No, O'Brien positioned himself as the victim being wronged by the justice system. He claimed his execution was a mistake and that he was forgiving those who were executing him. It was narcissism and self-victimization right up until his last breath. The man who poisoned his 8-year-old son and felt no remorse wanted us to feel sorry for him because he was being held accountable for his actions. The audacity is almost impressive in its complete lack of self-awareness. Timothy O'Brien's mother Danin, attended the execution. She deserved to see justice done for her son, and she got it. Outside the prison, a crowd of people gathered, some protesting the death penalty in general, some specifically there to celebrate O'Brien's execution. It's rare for executions to draw celebrating crowds, but O'Brien's crime was so heinous that even people who might normally oppose the death penalty made exceptions. One witness to the execution later described O'Brien's death as too peaceful compared to what he'd put Timothy through. And honestly, it's hard to argue with that assessment. Ronald O'Brien died, but his legacy, if you can call it that, lived on. And that legacy is where things get really interesting, because the impact of what he did extends far beyond one family or one neighborhood. O'Brien's crime became the catalyst for a nationwide panic about Halloween candy safety that persists to this day, more than 50 years later. Let's talk about the aftermath and the cultural impact, because this is where the story of the Candyman murder gets really fascinating from a sociological perspective. What Ronald O'Brien did was horrific, but what society did in response to what he did might be even more interesting, and in some ways more disturbing than the crime itself. Remember how I mentioned earlier that Halloween candy tampering was mostly an urban legend before 1974? That the actual incidents of strangers poisoning or otherwise tampering with Halloween candy were virtually non-existent? Well, Ronald O'Brien changed that narrative permanently. His crime validated every paranoid parent's worst fear about Halloween, even though, and this is crucial, he was a parent, not a stranger. The danger came from inside the family, not from some unknown boogeyman lurking in the neighborhood. But that nuance got lost in the panic that followed. Immediately after Timothy O'Brien's death, hospitals across the country started offering free candy X-ray services. Yes, you read that correctly. Hospitals were using expensive medical equipment to X-ray Snickers bars because parents were convinced that their children's Halloween candy might contain razor blades, needles, or poison. Never mind that X-rays can't detect most poisons, and that the actual statistical likelihood of finding anything dangerous in random Halloween candy was essentially zero. Fear doesn't care about statistics, and fear was running the show. Communities started organizing trunk or treat events at churches and schools, where kids could trick or treat in controlled environments from cars in parking lots instead of going door to door in neighborhoods. Some municipalities banned trick-or-treating altogether. Others instituted strict curfews for Halloween night. The entire cultural practice of Halloween was being reshaped by fear of a danger that, let me be absolutely clear about this, was not actually widespread. Parents became obsessive about inspecting their children's candy, throwing away anything that looked even slightly suspicious. Homemade treats, which had been a beloved part of Halloween, think popcorn balls, candy apples, homemade cookies, were suddenly viewed with suspicion and often discarded. The implicit trust that had existed between neighbors eroded almost overnight. Halloween went from a community celebration to a potentially dangerous activity that required constant vigilance and supervision. The media absolutely fed into this panic. News stations ran segments every October about candy safety, usually featuring scary statistics that weren't actually supported by data, interviews with concerned parents, and demonstrations of how to properly inspect candy. Newspapers published guides for safe trick-or-treating. Local news broadcasts warned parents to be vigilant. The message was clear. Halloween is dangerous. Strangers are dangerous. You must protect your children at all costs. But here's the thing. Extensive research into Halloween candy tampering, conducted in the decades since the Candyman case, has revealed that incidents of strangers actually poisoning or dangerously tampering with Halloween candy remain extraordinarily rare. So rare that they're statistically insignificant. So rare that you're literally more likely to be struck by lightning than to receive genuinely harmful candy from a stranger on Halloween. The sociologist Joel Best conducted one of the most comprehensive studies on this topic and found that in the decades since people started tracking these incidents, there have been virtually no confirmed cases of strangers poisoning or placing dangerous objects in Halloween candy with the intent to harm random children. The few cases that do exist, they're almost always hoaxes, accidents, or, and this is the key point, family members harming their own children. O'Brien wasn't the first person to harm his child and try to make it look like Halloween candy tampering, and he wouldn't be the last. There have been other cases where parents or relatives harmed children and tried to blame it on poisoned Halloween candy. But the stranger danger narrative? It's largely fiction, a contemporary legend that became accepted as fact because of cases like O'Brien's, even though O'Brien was the very opposite of a stranger. Think about the irony here. Ronald O'Brien murdered his son and tried to make it look like the work of a stranger giving out poisoned candy. He was caught almost immediately because his story didn't hold up under scrutiny. The investigation proved that family members, not strangers, are the real danger to children. And yet, the cultural response to his crime was to become more afraid of strangers and to implement safety measures designed to protect children from a threat that barely exists. We learned exactly the wrong lesson from the Candyman case, and we're still teaching that wrong lesson to new generations of parents every October. This is what sociologists call a moral panic, a collective anxiety about a perceived threat that is disproportionate to the actual danger. Moral panics happen when isolated incidents, amplified by media coverage and public fear, create widespread belief in a danger that doesn't actually exist at the level people believe it does. The Halloween candy tampering panic is a textbook example. One man, driven by greed, murdered his son using poisoned candy. That tragedy became the catalyst for nationwide fear of poisoned candy from strangers, even though strangers weren't the problem. And even though poison candy from anyone remains extraordinarily rare. But fear, once established, is incredibly hard to dislodge. Even today, decades after the Candyman case, parents still rigorously inspect their children's Halloween candy. Schools still send home flyers about candy safety. News stations still run the same segments every October, warning parents about potential dangers. The practice has become ritualized, a performance of parental vigilance that makes us feel like we're protecting our children even though we're protecting them from a danger that essentially doesn't exist. And here's the really dark part. While we're obsessing over Halloween candy and stranger danger, the actual threats to children go under-addressed. Children are far more likely to be harmed by family members or people they know than by strangers. The statistics are clear on this. The vast majority of child abuse, neglect, and murder is perpetrated by parents, relatives, or family friends, not by unknown individuals. The O'Brien case proved this point definitively, and yet the cultural response was to become more afraid of strangers rather than to address the harder, more uncomfortable truth about danger from within families. I'm not suggesting we should stop supervising our children or being cautious about Halloween safety. Obviously, parents should know where their kids are and what they're doing. But the specific fear of strangers tampering with Halloween candy is largely unfounded, and the elaborate rituals we've developed around candy inspection are mostly security theatre, actions that make us feel safer without actually addressing real dangers. The real legacy of Ronald O'Brien isn't that he made Halloween more dangerous, it's that he made us believe Halloween was more dangerous than it actually is, and in doing so, he changed the holiday forever. Halloween used to be about children having independence and freedom to roam their neighborhoods, collecting candy and building community connections. Now it's about parental supervision, controlled environments, and constant vigilance against threats that don't actually exist. O'Brien took something innocent and made it scary, not through his crime, but through the fear his crime generated. Now let's talk about the other ripple effects of the Candyman case, because the impact extended beyond just Halloween traditions. O'Brien's crime led to actual legislative changes, shifts in insurance industry practices, and a lasting cultural impact on how we think about trust, safety, and family. On the legislative front, Texas and several other states passed laws in the wake of the Candyman case, making it a felony to tamper with consumer products with intent to harm or threaten. These laws, often called anti-tampering statutes, impose severe penalties for anyone caught placing dangerous objects or substances in food or other products. The laws were partially a response to the Candyman case and partially a response to other product tampering incidents in the 1980s, most notably the Tylenol murders in Chicago in 1982, where someone placed cyanide-laced capsules in Tylenol bottles on store shelves, killing 7 people. The Tylenol case and the O'Brien case together created a legislative environment where product tampering became a major federal and state crime. The Federal Anti-Tampering Act was passed in 1983, making it a federal offense to tamper with consumer products. This led to the development of tamper-evident packaging that we now take for granted. Sealed bottles, shrink-wrapped containers, breakaway caps, that little plastic seal under the cap of your soda bottle. That exists partly because of cases like the Candyman and the Tylenol murders. Every time you peel back a safety seal, you're experiencing the lasting impact of these crimes. On the insurance industry side, O'Brien's case led to significant changes in how companies handle life insurance policies on children. Insurance companies became much more cautious about issuing large policies on minors, implementing stricter oversight and requiring more documentation. They started looking more carefully at policies taken out shortly before a death, and they implemented better information sharing systems to detect when multiple policies were being taken out on the same person. The goal was to prevent another O'Brien, someone using life insurance as a murder-for-profit scheme. These changes were necessary, but they also highlight something uncomfortable. Insurance companies had been surprisingly lax about these issues before the O'Brien case. Multiple companies had issued large policies on O'Brien's children without apparently communicating with each other or questioning why this family needed so much coverage. It took a highly publicized murder case to make the industry take seriously the fact that life insurance policies could be a motive for murder. The case also had a lasting impact on law enforcement and forensic investigation. The O'Brien investigation became a case study in how to handle poisoning cases, how to track down sources of poison, and how to build a circumstantial case against a defendant who doesn't confess. Police academies and forensic training programs still use the Candyman case as an example of effective investigative work, how a suspicious death can quickly be unraveled through careful attention to financial records, witness interviews, and forensic evidence. The speed with which investigators identified O'Brien as a suspect and built a case against him is still considered exemplary. From a psychological and criminological perspective, the O'Brien case contributed to our understanding of familial homicide motivated by financial gain. Criminal profilers and psychologists studied O'Brien extensively, trying to understand what kind of person could plan and execute the murder of their own child for money. What they found was that O'Brien fit a particular profile: narcissistic personality traits, a sense of entitlement, a willingness to manipulate others, and a profound lack of empathy. He viewed his children not as human beings with inherent worth, but as assets that could be liquidated to solve his financial problems. This profile has helped investigators identify and prevent other potential familial murders. When someone takes out unusually large insurance policies on family members, when their financial situation is desperate, when they exhibit certain behavioral patterns, these are red flags that can trigger investigations before tragedies occur. The O'Brien case taught law enforcement and mental health professionals what warning signs to look for. And while we'll never know how many potential crimes have been prevented as a result, it's reasonable to assume that studying cases like this has saved lives. The case also became a cultural touchstone in the true crime community. Books have been written about it. Documentaries have been produced. It's been featured in countless true crime TV shows, podcasts, and YouTube videos, including, well, this one you're watching right now. The story of the Candyman has been told and retold so many times that it's become almost mythological, a cautionary tale about greed, evil, and the dangers of assuming that monsters look monstrous. There's something particularly compelling about the Candyman case that keeps people coming back to it decades later. Maybe it's the Halloween connection, which taps into our cultural fascination with that holiday's mix of fun and fear. Maybe it's the shocking betrayal of a father murdering his son, which violates every instinct we have about parental love and protection. Maybe it's the calculated nature of the crime, which demonstrates a level of evil that's simultaneously fascinating and repulsive. Or maybe it's the lasting impact, the fact that every parent who inspects their kids' Halloween candy is, in some small way, responding to what Ronald O'Brien did 50 years ago. The Candyman case also raises uncomfortable questions about trust and safety that we're still grappling with today. How do we protect children without creating a culture of paranoia? How do we maintain community connections and traditions like trick-or-treating while acknowledging that dangers exist? How do we balance the statistical reality that children are much safer than we think they are, with the emotional reality that parents are hardwired to protect their offspring from even remote dangers? These questions don't have easy answers, and the O'Brien case sits right at the intersection of these competing concerns. But now we need to talk about something that might make you even more uncomfortable than the Candyman case itself: the copycat crimes and false reports that followed in its wake. Because one of the side effects of the massive media coverage of O'Brien's crime was that it gave other terrible people ideas, and it gave attention seekers a template for generating hysteria. In the years immediately following the Candyman case, there was a spike in reports of tampered Halloween candy. Parents would bring candy to police stations, claiming they'd found needles, razor blades, or suspicious substances in their children's trick-or-treat halls. Local news would run breathless reports about the discoveries. Communities would panic. And then, in the vast majority of cases, investigations would reveal that the reports were either mistakes or outright fabrications. Some of these were genuine misunderstandings: a wrapper that came partially unsealed in transport, a piece of candy that broke in a way that looked suspicious, a manufacturing defect that appeared to be tampering. But many were deliberate hoaxes, either by children seeking attention or by parents who'd become so paranoid about Halloween safety that they genuinely believed they were finding evidence of tampering where none existed. The human brain is really good at finding patterns and threats even when they're not actually there, especially when we're primed to expect them. And then there were the actually malicious incidents. People who, inspired by the media coverage of the Candyman case, decided to engage in actual tampering or to harm children using poison candy as the method. These cases were rare, but they did happen, and each one reinforced the public's fear that Halloween candy tampering was a widespread phenomenon. One notable case occurred in 1982 in Detroit, when a man named Jim Collins gave out Halloween candy that he knew had been contaminated with heroin. Collins was a drug dealer whose nephew had gotten into his drug stash and died of an overdose earlier that year. To deflect suspicion from himself, Collins decided to create a false narrative that the child had received heroin-laced candy while trick-or-treating. He took some of his heroin, mixed it with candy, and handed it out on Halloween to make it seem like there was a random poisoner in the neighborhood. Several children became ill, though fortunately, none died. When police investigated, the scheme unraveled quickly, and Collins was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to prison. Notice the pattern. Just like O'Brien, Collins was a family member trying to cover up a crime by making it look like Halloween candy tampering. The stranger danger narrative was being used as a smokescreen by people within the family or community, not by actual strangers. And yet, each of these cases, rather than highlighting that the danger comes from within trusted circles, instead reinforce the public's fear of poison candy from unknown sources. There have been other cases over the years, some verified, some not, of Halloween candy tampering. But when researchers have investigated these claims systematically, they found that the vast majority don't hold up under scrutiny. Joel Best, the sociologist I mentioned earlier, tracked every reported incident of Halloween candy tampering from 1958 to the present and found verified cases of strangers intentionally distributing dangerous candy to harm random children are essentially non-existent. The few real cases almost always involve family members or people the victims knew, and many of the reported cases turn out to be hoaxes, accidents, or misunderstandings. Yet the media continued and continues to report on these incidents every October, usually without the follow-up stories revealing that the initial reports were false. This creates a feedback loop. Media reports of alleged tampering increase public fear. Increased fear leads to more vigilant inspection and more reports of suspected tampering. More reports lead to more media coverage, and round we go. The result is a public perception that Halloween candy tampering is common, when empirical research shows it's vanishingly rare. This phenomenon isn't unique to Halloween candy. It's how moral panics work in general. A sensational crime occurs, media coverage amplifies it, public fear grows disproportionate to the actual risk, and then that fear becomes self-sustaining, even when evidence shows the risk was overstated. We saw it with the satanic panic of the 1980s, when rumors of widespread satanic ritual abuse turned out to be almost entirely fabricated. We saw it with the stranger danger panic of the 1980s and 90s, when fears of child abductions by strangers reached fever pitch, even though statistics showed children were far more likely to be harmed by people they knew. And we're seeing it now with various contemporary moral panics that follow the same pattern. The Candyman case was, in many ways, the perfect storm for creating a moral panic. It combined genuine tragedy, a child really did die, a culturally resonant event, Halloween, a violation of trust, a father killing his son, and a fear that was already present in the culture, poisoned candy. Mix those elements together, add extensive media coverage, and you get a panic that persists for decades, even after the evidence shows the fear is largely unfounded. So where does all of this leave us? What lessons should we take from the Candyman case and its aftermath? Let's break this down, because there are actually multiple lessons here, some of them contradictory, all of them important. First, the obvious lesson. Ronald O'Brien was a monster who deserved exactly what he got. His crime was calculating, cruel, and motivated by nothing more than greed. He murdered his own son and attempted to murder multiple other children for insurance money. He violated every principle of parental love and protection. His execution, while it didn't bring Timothy back or undo the trauma he inflicted on so many families, was justice served. Some crimes are so heinous that they forfeit the perpetrator's right to continue existing in society, and O'Brien's crime absolutely qualifies. Second lesson, the justice system, for all its flaws, worked exactly as it should in this case. Investigators quickly identified O'Brien as a suspect, built a solid case against him, and secured a conviction. The trial was fair. Multiple appeals courts reviewed it and found no significant errors. The sentence was proportional to the crime. From investigation to conviction to execution, the O'Brien case is an example of the justice system functioning properly. It's worth noting because we often focus on cases where the system fails: wrongful convictions, botched investigations, unjust sentences. But sometimes the system gets it right, and we should acknowledge that. Third lesson, and this one's more complicated. The danger to children almost never comes from where we think it does. We've built an entire infrastructure of Halloween safety measures designed to protect kids from strangers tampering with candy, when the actual statistical risk of that happening is essentially zero. Meanwhile, the real dangers to children, abuse, neglect, and violence from family members and trusted adults, receive less attention and fewer resources. If we really wanted to protect children, we'd be investing heavily in identifying and preventing familial abuse, improving child protective services, and addressing the root causes of domestic violence. Instead, we X-ray Milky Ways and throw away homemade cookies from the neighbors. This isn't to say we should be careless about Halloween safety. Obviously, children should be supervised. Candy should be inspected, if only to remove the gross stuff like raisins and candy corn. And basic precautions should be taken. But the level of fear and the extent of the measures we've implemented are disproportionate to the actual risk. We're spending enormous amounts of social and emotional energy protecting children from a threat that barely exists, while under-addressing the threats that actually kill and harm kids every day. Fourth lesson: media coverage matters, and sensationalism has consequences. The extensive, often hysterical media coverage of the Candyman case and subsequent Halloween candy scares created a lasting panic that persists despite contradicting evidence. Media outlets have a responsibility to report accurately, to provide context, to follow up on stories when initial reports turn out to be false, and to avoid sensationalizing rare events in ways that create disproportionate fear. They don't always live up to that responsibility, and the Halloween candy panic is a clear example of the consequences. Fifth lesson: trust, once broken, is incredibly hard to rebuild. The Candyman case damaged community trust in ways that persist decades later. Halloween used to be a community event where neighbors connected with each other, where homemade treats were shared and appreciated, where kids could roam with relative freedom. O'Brien's crime and the panic it generated destroyed much of that. We live in a more suspicious, more fearful, more isolated society, partly because of cases like this. Rebuilding that trust requires acknowledging where the real dangers lie and making evidence-based decisions about safety rather than fear-based ones. Sixth lesson: financial desperation makes people do terrible things, and as a society, we should probably think about that. O'Brien was drowning in debt, and rather than seeking bankruptcy protection or other legal remedies, he chose murder. While his crime was extreme and absolutely his responsibility, the broader context of his financial desperation raises questions about how we handle debt, financial education, and economic safety nets. Most people in dire financial straits don't murder their children for insurance money, obviously. But financial stress is a contributing factor in all sorts of criminal behavior. Addressing economic inequality and providing better support systems for people in financial crisis might prevent some of the desperation that leads to crime. Seventh lesson: evil doesn't always look like we expect it to. O'Brien was, by all outward appearances, a normal guy. A father, a churchgoer, a member of the community. He didn't have a criminal record. He didn't fit any obvious profile of a murderer. He was just a regular person who made monstrous choices. This is a reminder that we can't always identify dangerous people by appearance or initial impression. The monsters don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they look just like everyone else, which is precisely what makes them so dangerous. Eighth lesson. The insurance industry needed better safeguards, and to their credit, they implemented them after cases like O'Brien's exposed the gaps. The ability to take out multiple large policies on children without any oversight or communication between companies was a massive vulnerability. The industry's response, better information sharing, more scrutiny of large policies on minors, increased investigation of claims where large policies were recently issued, was appropriate and necessary. It's an example of how tragic cases can lead to positive systemic changes that prevent future tragedies. Ninth lesson, and this one's more philosophical. We need to be careful about learning the right lessons from rare but sensational crimes. The Candyman case was terrible, but it was also extremely rare. One man in one neighborhood on one Halloween night committed a horrific crime. The appropriate response would have been to ensure that his particular crime was investigated and prosecuted, which happened, to implement reasonable insurance safeguards, which happened, and to continue treating Halloween as the generally safe community event it actually is, which didn't happen. Instead, we extrapolated from one case to a nationwide panic about a danger that doesn't actually exist at the scale we fear. We need to get better at distinguishing between genuine, widespread threats and rare but sensational events that capture our attention without actually representing common dangers. 10th lesson. Some crimes are so beyond the pale that they become cultural touchstones, cautionary tales that get passed down through generations. The Candyman case is one of those crimes. It's been 50 years, and we're still talking about it. Parents who weren't even born when Timothy O'Brien died are now inspecting their own children's Halloween candy because of what Ronald O'Brien did. The case has transcended its specific details to become a symbol of betrayal, evil, and the corruption of innocence. Whether that's appropriate or healthy is debatable, but it's undeniably true. Some crimes echo through time, and the Candyman murder is one of them. Now let's talk about the victims, the real victims. Because in all the discussion of true crime and investigations and cultural impact, we sometimes lose sight of the actual human beings whose lives were destroyed by Ronald O'Brien's actions. Timothy O'Brien was 8 years old when his father murdered him. 8. He was in 3rd grade. He liked baseball and riding his bike, and probably had a favorite cartoon and a best friend, and dreams about what he wanted to be when he grew up. He went trick-or-treating on Halloween night, expecting to collect candy and have fun, and instead he was given poison by his own father. He complained that the candy tasted bitter, and his father, the person who should have protected him above all else, told him to keep eating it. Timothy's last moments were agonizing. Seizures, vomiting, the terror of not being able to breathe. And he had no idea why it was happening. He died in a hospital, surrounded by medical professionals who couldn't save him, because his father had planned his death months in advance and executed that plan with cold precision. Think about what that means. Think about the betrayal. Children trust their parents implicitly because they're hardwired to. It's a survival mechanism built into human development. We trust that the adults who brought us into the world will protect us, feed us, keep us safe. Timothy trusted his father, and that trust was weaponized against him. The man he looked up to, the man who was supposed to love him unconditionally, had decided he was worth more dead than alive. That kind of betrayal is almost incomprehensible. It violates everything we understand about parental love and family bonds. Elizabeth O'Brien, Timothy's 5-year-old sister, survived only because she didn't eat her poisoned pixie sticks that night. But in every other way that matters, her life was destroyed too. She lost her brother. She learned that her father tried to murder her. She had to grow up knowing that the man who was supposed to protect her had instead planned to kill her for money. The psychological trauma of that is difficult to even imagine. How do you trust anyone after learning that your own father wanted you dead? How do you form healthy relationships when your first and most important relationship with your parent was revealed to be a facade hiding murderous intent? Elizabeth was just 5 years old. She should have been worried about kindergarten and learning to read and whether Santa Claus was going to bring her the toy she wanted for Christmas. Instead, she had to process the fact that her father was a murderer and that she'd come within inches of being his victim. She had to grow up without her brother, without her father, in the shadow of one of the most notorious crimes in Texas history. Every time someone talked about the Candyman case, in the news, in true crime shows, in casual conversation, they were talking about her family, her trauma, her loss. Daneen O'Brien, the children's mother and Ronald's wife, lost everything in one terrible night. She lost her son to murder. She lost her husband to his own evil choices. She lost her marriage, her sense of safety, her ability to trust her own judgment about the people in her life. She'd lived with Ronald for years, shared a bed with him, raised children with him, and never suspected he was capable of something so monstrous. How do you live with that? How do you reconcile the person you thought you knew with the person he actually was? Daneen had to deal with the immediate trauma of Timothy's death while simultaneously learning that her husband was responsible. She had to protect Elizabeth while processing her own grief and betrayal. She had to cooperate with the investigation, which meant reliving the trauma repeatedly. She had to testify at the trial. She had to see her husband sentenced to death, which, regardless of what he'd done, must have been complicated emotionally. She had to rebuild a life for herself and Elizabeth from the ashes of the family Ronald had destroyed. And unlike Ronald, who had plenty of time to plan his crime and prepare mentally for what he was going to do, Daneen had no warning, no time to prepare. One night, she was a wife and mother with 2 children. The next day, her son was dead and her husband was a murderer. The whiplash of that kind of sudden trauma is devastating in ways that are hard to articulate. The life she thought she had was revealed to be a lie. The future she'd envisioned evaporated. Everything changed in one night, and she had no choice but to deal with it. Then there are the other families, the Bettons, whose children received poisoned pixie sticks, and the Parkers, whose son Whitney also received one. These families were collateral damage in O'Brien's scheme. They'd done nothing wrong. They'd simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, connected to the wrong person. Their children came within inches of death because Ronald O'Brien decided he needed to create cover for his crime by poisoning multiple kids. Imagine learning that your child had been carrying around lethal poison in their Halloween bag. That if they'd been a little hungrier, a little less obedient about waiting to eat candy, a little more interested in that particular pixie sticks, they'd be dead. Imagine knowing that someone you considered a friend, a neighbor, a fellow church member had casually handed your child a murder weapon while smiling and making small talk. The betrayal, the horror, the retroactive fear, it must have been overwhelming. These families had to deal with the trauma of almost losing their children, the anger at O'Brien for putting them at risk, the complicated feelings about Timothy's death, relief that it wasn't their child mixed with guilt about feeling that relief, and the knowledge that someone they trusted was actually a monster. They had to explain to their children what had happened in age-appropriate ways. They had to reassure kids who now had reason to be afraid of Halloween, of candy, of trusted adults. They had to process their own fear and anger while maintaining some sense of normalcy for their families. And beyond the immediate victims, think about the broader community impact. The other families in Deer Park who went trick-or-treating that night and then learned what had happened. The neighbors who'd known the O'Briens and never suspected anything. The church community that had to reconcile the friendly man they knew with the monster he'd been revealed to be. The children who were Timothy's classmates and friends, who had to process the death of a peer in such horrific circumstances. Violent crime doesn't just affect the immediate victims, it ripples outward, creating waves of trauma, fear, and damage that extend far beyond the primary targets. The Candyman case traumatized an entire community, and then through media coverage, it traumatized a nation. Every parent who heard about Timothy O'Brien's death experienced a moment of fear, imagining their own child in that situation. Every child who heard about it, and trust me, kids heard about it, they always do, added it to their mental catalog of things to be afraid of. We need to remember these victims, not just as footnotes in a true crime story, but as real people whose lives were irrevocably altered by one man's evil choices. They didn't ask to be part of this story. They didn't deserve what happened to them. They were innocent people who had the misfortune of being connected to Ronald O'Brien, and they paid a price for that connection that continues to this day. Timothy O'Brien never got to grow up. He never got to go to high school, fall in love, choose a career, have children of his own. He never got to become the person he might have been. All of that potential, or all of those possible futures, were erased by his father's greed. And that's the ultimate tragedy of this case. Not just that Timothy died, but that he died for nothing. Not for love or passion or even twisted ideology. For money. For insurance payouts that O'Brien never even collected. Timothy's life was taken for a benefit his father never received. It was meaningless, senseless, a waste on every possible level. As we come toward the end of this deep dive into one of the darkest chapters in Halloween history, I want to address something that might be on your mind. Why do we tell these stories? Why do we revisit these terrible crimes, examining them from every angle, analyzing every detail? What's the point of spending hours, as you're doing right now, learning about something so disturbing and tragic? There are a few answers to that question, and they're worth considering. First, there's the obvious true crime fan answer. These stories are compelling in the same way that horror movies are compelling. They let us experience fear and danger from a safe distance. They satisfy our curiosity about the darker aspects of human nature without requiring us to actually encounter that darkness in our own lives. There's nothing wrong with being interested in true crime. It's one of the most popular genres across all media, for good reason. Humans have been telling stories about murder and criminals since we started telling stories at all. It's part of how we process the existence of evil and danger in the world. But beyond entertainment value, there's educational value in studying cases like the Candyman murder. We learn about how investigations work, how evidence is gathered and presented, how the justice system functions or doesn't function. We learn about human psychology, what motivates people to commit terrible crimes, how seemingly normal people can hide monstrous tendencies, what warning signs might indicate danger. We learn about forensic science, about poison, about insurance fraud. We learn about media influence and moral panics and how society responds to tragedy. There's also a memorial aspect to telling these stories. By talking about Timothy O'Brien, by saying his name and remembering what happened to him, we ensure that he's not forgotten. His death wasn't meaningless if it led to changes that protect other children, if it taught us lessons about where danger really comes from, if it made even one person more aware of the warning signs of financial desperation leading to violence. That doesn't make his death okay. Nothing makes it okay. But it means his short life had impact beyond what his father intended. Telling these stories also serves as a warning. The Candyman case teaches us to be aware that danger can come from unexpected places, that financial desperation can lead to terrible choices, that insurance policies on children should raise red flags, that the justice system needs to be vigilant about familial violence. These aren't comfortable lessons, but they're important ones. If even one insurance agent sees this video and decides to ask more questions before issuing a large policy on a child, if even one person recognizes warning signs in someone they know and intervenes before tragedy strikes, then talking about these difficult cases serves a purpose beyond mere entertainment. There's also something to be said for confronting evil directly and calling it what it is. Ronald O'Brien was evil, not mentally ill, though mental health evaluations could have revealed issues, not misunderstood, not a victim of circumstances, evil. He made a conscious choice to murder his own child for money, and he planned it methodically over months. He was willing to kill multiple children to cover his tracks. He showed no genuine remorse even at his execution. That kind of evil exists in the world, and pretending it doesn't, shying away from examining it, doesn't protect us. Understanding it, studying it, and learning to recognize it might. And finally, there's the community aspect of true crime fandom. By sharing these stories, by discussing them in comment sections and forums and friend groups, we create connections with other people. We process difficult emotions collectively. We remind ourselves that we're not alone in our fascination with or fear of these dark topics. The true crime community, for all its faults and occasional ghoulishness, is a community. People connecting over shared interests, supporting each other through difficult discussions, and collectively trying to make sense of the senseless. But, and this is important, we also need to be mindful of how we engage with these stories. True crime isn't just entertainment. It's about real people who experienced real trauma. The victims deserve respect, not sensationalism. Their families deserve sensitivity, not exploitation. There's a fine line between educating and entertaining versus exploiting and sensationalizing. And as consumers and creators of true crime content, we need to be aware of that line and try not to cross it. I've tried throughout this video to treat Timothy O'Brien's death with the gravity it deserves, to remember him as a real child and not just a plot point in a story, to acknowledge the trauma his death caused to real people who are still alive today. I hope I've succeeded in that. But I also recognize that by making this video, by telling this story, I'm participating in the true crime industry that turns tragedy into content. That's an uncomfortable reality, and it's something anyone who engages with true crime needs to think about. So let's bring this all together and talk about what the Candyman case means today, 5 decades after it happened. Because this isn't just a historical curiosity or a spooky Halloween story. This case continues to shape how we think about safety, trust, parenting, and community in ways both obvious and subtle. Every October, when parents across America inspect their children's Halloween candy, they're responding to the fear that Ronald O'Brien created. Every time a school hosts a trunk or treat event, instead of sending kids door to door in neighborhoods, that's O'Brien's legacy. Every time someone throws away a homemade treat from a neighbor because it might not be safe, that's the world O'Brien helped create. He didn't just murder his son. He murdered a certain kind of innocence and trust that American culture had about Halloween and about community. The question is that response proportional and appropriate, or is it an overreaction based on fear rather than facts? The evidence suggests it's more the latter than the former. Halloween candy tampering by strangers remains extraordinarily rare. The actual risk to children hasn't changed significantly since before the Candyman case. What changed was our perception of the risk, and that perception has shaped behavior in ways that persist, despite contradicting evidence. This isn't unique to Halloween candy fears. We see the same pattern in many areas of modern parenting and safety culture. Parents today supervise their children far more intensively than previous generations did, driven by fears of abduction, abuse, and danger that are statistically less likely than parents believe. Children have less independence, less free-range exploration, less opportunity to take risks and learn from them than previous generations. Some of this increased supervision is good. We've learned things about child safety and development that make us better parents in many ways. But some of it is driven by fears that don't match statistical reality, and that overprotection comes with costs. Children who are never allowed to take risks don't learn how to assess danger. Kids who are constantly supervised don't develop independence and problem-solving skills. Communities where people don't know their neighbors, where trust has eroded to the point that we won't even accept homemade cookies from the people who live next door, are less connected and less resilient. There are trade-offs to the safety culture we've built, and the Candyman case is part of what built it. So what's the answer? How do we find a balance between legitimate safety concerns and paranoid overreaction? That's genuinely complicated, and I don't pretend to have a perfect answer. But I think part of the solution is being informed about actual risks versus perceived risks, making evidence-based decisions rather than fear-based ones, and working to rebuild community trust that has been eroded by cases like O'Brien's. We can acknowledge that Ronald O'Brien was a monster who committed a terrible crime, while also acknowledging that he's not representative of the community at large. We can inspect our kids' Halloween candy as a reasonable precaution while recognizing that the actual risk is minimal. We can supervise our children appropriately while also giving them age-appropriate independence. We can be aware of the real dangers, which come primarily from family members and people children know, not from strangers, while not becoming so paranoid that we can't function or build normal social connections. The Candyman case should teach us to be vigilant about the actual dangers: familial violence, financial desperation leading to crime, warning signs that someone might harm their own family. It should not teach us to be afraid of our neighbors or to view every Halloween tradition as a potential threat. But unfortunately, the latter is largely what happened, and untangling that fear from reality is difficult. One positive that has emerged from the intense scrutiny of Halloween safety is that the ritual of candy inspection has become a bonding moment for many families. Parents and children sitting together, going through the hall, making trades, telling stories about the houses they visited. It's become its own tradition. If we're going to do this inspection anyway, even if the actual risk is minimal, we might as well make it meaningful and use it as an opportunity to connect with our kids. That's taking a practice born from fear and transforming it into something positive. And that's not nothing. The Candyman case also continues to be relevant in discussions about the death penalty. O'Brien's execution is often cited by death penalty supporters as an example of when capital punishment is clearly justified, a heinous, premeditated crime with overwhelming evidence and no mitigating circumstances. His crime was so beyond the pale that even many people who generally oppose the death penalty make exceptions for cases like his. On the other hand, death penalty opponents point out that executing O'Brien didn't bring Timothy back, didn't undo the trauma he caused, and arguably gave him an easier death than the one he inflicted on his son. The debate continues, and the Candyman case remains a touchstone in that discussion. The case is also relevant to ongoing discussions about insurance fraud, product tampering laws, and financial crimes. Every few years, there's another case of someone trying to fake an accident or murder a family member for insurance money, and investigators trained on cases like O'Brien's are better equipped to recognize the pattern and catch the perpetrators. The legislative and industry changes prompted by the Candyman case continue to protect people today. And on a broader cultural level, the Candyman case is part of a larger conversation about trust, safety, and how we navigate a world that contains both genuine dangers and exaggerated fears. It's about media literacy, understanding how sensational coverage can create panics that don't match statistical reality. It's about critical thinking, being able to separate our emotional responses from rational risk assessment. It's about community, deciding whether we want to live in a world of suspicion and isolation or one of connection and trust. 50 years after Timothy O'Brien's death, we're still grappling with these questions, and we probably will be for another 50 years. The Candyman case won't be forgotten because it taps into something fundamental about our fears as parents, as community members, as human beings trying to keep ourselves and our loved ones safe in an uncertain world. All right, we're in the home stretch here, so let's wrap this up by circling back to where we started. Halloween, that weird, wonderful, slightly creepy holiday that brings out both the best and worst in us. Because ultimately, the Candyman case is a Halloween story, not in the fun, spooky way we usually mean that, but in a way that fundamentally changed what Halloween means to American culture. Before 1974, Halloween was in its golden age. It was the one night a year when kids had real freedom. They could roam the neighborhood after dark, knock on strangers' doors, collect absurd amounts of candy, and generally feel like they were getting away with something even though everyone knew exactly what they were doing. Parents were relatively hands-off. The biggest concerns were kids eating too much candy and maybe getting into some minor mischief with toilet paper and eggs. It was innocent, community-focused, and fun. The Candyman case didn't single-handedly destroy that innocence. There were other factors, including broader cultural shifts toward a more intensive parenting and increased fear of strangers, but it was a major catalyst. O'Brien weaponized the one night that was supposed to be pure childhood joy, and in doing so, he made it scary in ways it was never meant to be. Halloween is supposed to be about pretend scares, fake blood, and haunted houses you can leave whenever they get too intense. O'Brien made it about real danger hiding in plain sight, and that's a much harder fear to shake. But here's the thing. Halloween has survived. It's changed, certainly. It's more supervised, more cautious, more risk-averse than it used to be. But kids still dress up. Families still carve pumpkins. Communities still celebrate. The holiday adapted to our increased fear of candy tampering and stranger danger. But it didn't disappear. That's actually kind of beautiful if you think about it. The resilience of a cultural tradition in the face of trauma. And maybe there's a lesson there about resilience in general. The Candyman case was terrible. It traumatized individuals and communities. It changed how we think about Halloween and safety. But it didn't destroy us. We adapted, we learned, some right lessons and some wrong ones, and we moved forward. Timothy O'Brien's death was a tragedy, but the way we responded to it, the changes we made, the conversations we had, the increased awareness of both real and imagined dangers, represents our attempt to ensure that his death meant something. Does that make it okay? Number. Nothing makes it okay. An 8-year-old boy died because his father valued money more than his son's life. And that's a tragedy that can't be redeemed or justified or made meaningful enough to balance out the loss. But we can honor Timothy's memory by learning from what happened to him, by telling his story, by ensuring that the changes prompted by his death actually protect other children rather than just making us feel safer without addressing real dangers. And we can honor his memory by not letting Ronald O'Brien's evil define our entire worldview. Yes, terrible people exist. Yes, sometimes they're people we trust. Yes, dangers can come from unexpected places. But most people are good. Most parents love their children and would die to protect them. Most neighbors mean us no harm. Most Halloween candy is exactly what it appears to be. Sugar in colorful wrappers given by people who just want to see kids smile. The Candyman was an outlier, an aberration, a monster wearing a human mask. He doesn't represent humanity. He represents the worst possible version of humanity, and we diminish ourselves if we let his actions convince us that everyone is potentially that dangerous. So where does that leave us as we come to the end of this deep dive into one of the darkest true crime stories in American history? It leaves us with a complicated mix of emotions and takeaways. Horror at what Ronald O'Brien did, sadness for Timothy and all the other victims, anger at the betrayal, frustration at how society learned some of the wrong lessons, relief that justice was served, gratitude that we can study these cases from a safe distance rather than experiencing them firsthand. And maybe, if we're being honest, a little bit of morbid fascination at the sheer audacity of O'Brien's plan and the depths of evil he was willing to plumb. Because that's part of why we're drawn to true crime. It shows us the darkest corners of human nature. And there's something compelling about staring into that darkness, understanding it, and then stepping back into the light, knowing we've learned something. The Candyman case teaches us that monsters are real, but they're not the monsters we expect. They don't live in sewers or haunt abandoned houses. They live in suburban homes and go to church and have jobs and families. They look like everyone else because they are everyone else, until suddenly they're not, until they make choices that reveal what they really are underneath the mask of normalcy. It teaches us that financial desperation can drive people to unthinkable acts, and that maybe we should think more carefully about how our economic systems create situations where people feel backed into corners with no way out. Most people don't respond to financial stress by murdering their children, but financial stress is a factor in all sorts of harmful behaviors, and addressing it might prevent some percentage of tragedies. It teaches us that children are most at risk from people they know and trust, not from strangers. This is the lesson we should have learned from the Candyman case, but instead we learned to fear strangers and instituted safety measures that don't address the actual sources of danger to children. Maybe it's time to recalibrate our fears and our safety measures to match reality. It teaches us that media coverage shapes our perceptions of risk in ways that don't always match statistical reality, and that we need to be more media literate, more critical in our consumption of news, and more aware of how sensational stories can create lasting fears that outlive the actual danger. It teaches us that the justice system can work when investigators are thorough, prosecutors are competent, and evidence is overwhelming. O'Brien was caught quickly, tried fairly, and executed for his crime. That doesn't happen in every case. We know that wrongful convictions exist, that investigations are sometimes botched, that the system has serious flaws. But the O'Brien case shows the system at its best, functioning as it's supposed to function. It teaches us that some crimes echo through time, becoming cultural touchstones that shape society in ways far beyond the immediate tragedy. The Candyman case will be told and retold as long as people celebrate Halloween and are interested in true crime. It's become part of our cultural mythology, a cautionary tale that parents whisper to each other and that true crime enthusiasts study in detail. And perhaps most importantly, it teaches us that we need to remember the victims, not just as statistics or story elements, but as real people with real lives that were really destroyed by one man's evil choices. Timothy O'Brien deserved to grow up. Elizabeth O'Brien deserved a childhood that wasn't defined by trauma. Daneen O'Brien deserved a partner who valued his family. The other children deserved to trick or treat without nearly being murdered. These were real people, and they matter more than the story we tell about what happened to them. So here's where I typically would do a call to action, asking you to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, all that YouTube stuff. And I am going to ask you to do those things because that's how this platform works and how creators survive. But before I do that, I want you to do something else. This Halloween, when you're helping your kids sort through their candy or handing out treats to neighborhood children, or just enjoying the holiday in whatever way you celebrate it, take a moment to remember Timothy O'Brien. Remember that he was a real kid who loved Halloween and should have been able to enjoy it. Remember that the danger that took his life came from where he least expected it, from someone who was supposed to protect him. Remember that the real threats to children almost never come from strangers with poisoned candy. And then, despite knowing this story, despite understanding the darkness that exists in the world, make a choice to not let that darkness define your experience. Trust your neighbors, not blindly, not foolishly, but with the understanding that most people are good and that community connections are valuable even though they come with some level of risk. Let your kids have appropriate independence for their age. Inspect the candy if it makes you feel better. But don't let the inspection become a ritual of fear that overshadows the fun of the holiday. Choose to live in a world of connection rather than suspicion, of community rather than isolation, of reasonable caution rather than paranoid fear. That's how we win against people like Ronald O'Brien, not by letting their evil reshape our entire worldview, but by refusing to let them steal our joy, our trust, and our sense of community. The best revenge against someone who tried to ruin Halloween is to keep celebrating it, to keep building connections with neighbors, to keep letting kids experience the magic and freedom that make the holiday special. Ronald O'Brien wanted to turn Halloween into something terrifying for his own selfish purposes. We don't have to let him succeed. We can acknowledge what he did, learn appropriate lessons from it, and still choose to live in a world where Halloween is about joy and community rather than fear and suspicion. That's not naive. That's not foolish. That's resilient. That's choosing to be defined by our values rather than by our fears. And if you take nothing else from this video, if you forget all the specific details and dates and names, remember this: the call is coming from inside the house. The danger to children almost never comes from the strangers we're taught to fear. It comes from people they know, people they trust, people in their own families. If we really want to protect kids, we need to address familial violence, improve child protective services, recognize warning signs of abuse, and create systems that intervene before tragedies happen. Throwing away homemade cookies from neighbors doesn't protect children. Creating a culture where it's okay to ask for help when you're struggling financially or emotionally does. Investing in social services and mental health support does. Recognizing that parents who suddenly take out large insurance policies on their children should be subject to scrutiny does. The Candyman case should have taught us to look inward, to our own communities and families, for the sources of danger. Instead, it taught us to fear outward, to be suspicious of everyone and everything. 50 years later, maybe it's time to learn the right lesson. All right, now for the actual call to action part of the program. If you made it this far, and seriously, if you're still watching, you deserve some kind of award for attention span because this has been a marathon. please consider liking this video. It helps the algorithm gods smile upon my humble channel and recommend this content to other people who are interested in true crime deep dives. Subscribe to the channel if you want more content like this. Deep dives into cases that changed history, thorough examinations of how crimes were solved, and thoughtful discussion of the broader implications of true crime cases. I try to treat these stories with the respect they deserve while still making them engaging and informative. And if that's your vibe, you'll probably like the other content on the channel. Hit the notification bell if you want to be alerted when I post new videos. I don't post daily because I'd rather make one really good, thoroughly researched video than pump out daily content that's shallow and repetitive. Quality over quantity is the motto here. Comment below with your thoughts on the Candyman case. Do you remember when this happened? Did your parents inspect your Halloween candy growing up? Do you inspect your own kids' candy now? Do you think we learned the right lessons from this case or the wrong ones? Do you think O'Brien's execution was justice, or do you have complicated feelings about the death penalty? I genuinely want to know what you think, and I read all the comments, even though I can't always respond to everyone. Share this video if you think someone else would be interested in it. True crime fans, Halloween enthusiasts, people interested in how moral panics develop, criminology students, psychology nerds. There are probably people in your life who'd find this content interesting. Just maybe give them a heads up that it's long and heavy before they commit to hitting play. And if you really want to support the channel, consider joining as a member or checking out the Patreon. Making these deep dive videos takes an enormous amount of time. The research alone for this one took weeks, and financial support from viewers makes it possible to keep creating this kind of content. Plus, members and patrons get access to bonus content, early releases, and behind-the-scenes stuff about how these videos are made. But honestly, even if you just watch, that's support too. Every view tells the algorithm that this content is worth showing to other people. Every minute watched increases the video's ranking. You being here right now, having made it to the end of this absurdly long deep dive into the Candyman case, is supporting the channel just by virtue of your attention. So thank you, genuinely. Thank you for caring about this story, for caring about Timothy O'Brien's memory, for being willing to spend your time learning about something difficult and uncomfortable, because you think it's important to understand these dark corners of human nature. Let me leave you with one final thought as we close out this journey into the darkest Halloween night in American history. True crime isn't just about the criminals. It's not really even mostly about the criminals, though they get most of the attention and the catchy nicknames. True crime is about us, about how we respond to tragedy, how we process evil, how we protect ourselves and our communities, how we remember victims, how we seek justice, and how we try to make sense of senseless violence. The Candyman case is ultimately a story about betrayal. A father betraying his son, a trusted community member betraying his neighbors, a human being betraying the basic social contracts that make civilization possible. But it's also a story about how quickly investigators worked to find justice for Timothy, how the community rallied to support the surviving victims, how the justice system functioned properly to convict and punish the perpetrator, and how society, however imperfectly, try to implement changes to prevent similar tragedies in the future. We got some things right and some things wrong in our response to the Candyman case. We got right the prosecution and conviction of Ronald O'Brien. We got right the changes to insurance industry practices. We got right the anti-tampering legislation. We got wrong the focus on stranger danger when the danger came from within the family. We got wrong the level of fear about Halloween candy that didn't match the actual statistical risk. We got wrong the erosion of community trust and the shift toward isolation and suspicion. But we tried, imperfectly, messily, with lots of missteps along the way. We tried to respond to an unthinkable tragedy in ways that would protect children and honor Timothy's memory. That's what humans do. We experience trauma. We make sense of it however we can. We implement changes that we think will prevent similar tragedies, and we move forward. Sometimes we overcorrect. Sometimes we learn the wrong lessons. But we're always trying to create a safer world for our children, even when our methods are flawed. The fact that you watched this video all the way to the end, to all the dark details and difficult truths, suggests that you're someone who thinks these stories matter. That understanding how crimes happen, how they're solved, and how they impact society is worth your time and attention. That remembering victims and seeking to learn from tragedies is important. I agree with you. These stories do matter. Not because they're entertaining, though they can be that too, but because they teach us about the full spectrum of human nature, from the worst evil to the best responses to that evil. Timothy O'Brien has been dead for 50 years. Ronald O'Brien has been dead for 40 years. But their story lives on, told and retold by true crime enthusiasts, criminologists, psychologists, and random YouTube creators making absurdly long videos about the case. That's as close to immortality as most of us get. Our stories outliving our bodies, being told to new generations who learn from what happened to us. Timothy's story is being told right now by me to you. And by watching this video, by learning about what happened to him, by understanding the circumstances of his death and the impact it had on society, you're participating in keeping his memory alive. You're ensuring that his death wasn't completely meaningless, that it taught lessons, however imperfectly learned, to people who never knew him but can honor his memory by understanding what happened and why. So as we close out this video, let me say, Timothy Mark O'Brien, born February 15th, 1966, died October 31st, 1974, 8 years old, a child who loved Halloween and baseball and his bike and probably 100 other things we'll never know about, because his life was cut short by someone who should have protected him. He deserved to grow up. He deserved to have a future. He deserved to be remembered as more than a victim in a true crime story. But since this is the way his story ended, let's at least remember him correctly. Not as a cautionary tale about stranger danger, but as a victim of familial violence. Not as a reason to fear Halloween, but as a reason to cherish it and the community connections it represents. Not as a statistic, but as a real child with a real life that mattered. Remember Timothy. Remember the lessons of the Candyman case, both the ones we learned and the ones we should have learned. Remember that most people are good, most Halloween candy is safe, and the real dangers to children come from the places we least expect them. Remember to check on your friends and family who might be struggling financially or emotionally. Remember that community and trust are worth preserving even though they come with risks. Remember that monsters look like everyone else until they reveal themselves. And finally, remember to celebrate Halloween. Dress up, carve pumpkins, hand out candy to neighborhood kids with smiles and enthusiasm. Let your own children experience the magic and slight danger and sense of freedom that make the holiday special. Don't let Ronald O'Brien's evil steal that from you or from them. The best way to honor Timothy's memory is to keep loving the holiday he never got to enjoy again. Alright, that's it. That's the video. The night trick or treating would never be the same. The story of the Candyman murder, Ronald O'Brien's evil, Timothy O'Brien's tragedy, and the 50 years of ripple effects that followed. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. Thank you for caring enough about this story to spend, good Lord, how long has this video been? Your valuable time learning about it. Thank you for being the kind of person who thinks understanding darkness is worth the discomfort it brings. Stay safe out there. Check your candy if it makes you feel better. Hug your kids. Value your community. Remember Timothy and have a happy Halloween. Whatever that means to you in the complicated world we live in, where joy and tragedy exist side by side, and we do our best to navigate between them. Until next time, this has been your deep dive into true crime history. I'll see you in the next one. Peace. Peace. Peace.